She came to a frozen base in northern Minnesota for the simplest reason on earth to surprise her husband on their 8th anniversary. A boxed cake mix in her duffel, a silver ring warming her palm through fabric. Just a rookie army nurse trying to steal one normal night back from a life of missed birthdays and long deployments. Then the first explosion hit the north fence, and the quiet turned into a weapon. Here's the question that won't let go when the person you love is bleeding out in the snow. Do you stay who you've been, or become who you swore you'd never be again? What you're about to hear isn't luck, and it isn't a fairy tale. It's a field lesson in survival medicine, and the kind of discipline that leaves no room for fear. Watch to the end and tell me where you're watching from. Like and comment your city. The quiet she'd come for was real at first. It sat on the tree line like a weight thick enough to make her footsteps sound too loud. Even now, with that question clawing at the back of her throat, Brooke Halstead could still taste the reason she'd volunteered. Burnt coffee. Cheap sugar. The tiny stubborn hope that for one night she could be more than the person who patched other people back together. 2 weeks earlier, she had stood in a fluorescent hallway at Fort Belvoir, scrolling through a routine staffing request that most nurses pretended not to see. Temporary medical coverage needed for a remote early warning site in northern Minnesota. Short rotation, harsh conditions, limited amenities, not glamorous enough for medals, not comfortable enough for volunteers. The kind of assignment that earned you an extra line on a chart and a few quiet nods from people who knew what it meant to show up where no one wanted to be. Her supervisor had looked up from a clipboard and raised an eyebrow when Brooke said evenly that she'd take it. "You've got seniority," Major Whittaker said. "You don't have to." Brooke kept her face neutral. She had learned years ago that the best way to hide an emotional decision was to make it sound procedural. "I'm available," she said. "I can cover it." Whittaker studied her for a beat longer than necessary. The major had been in military medicine long enough to recognize the difference between availability and motive. "You sure?" Whittaker asked. Brooke nodded once. When she left the office, she didn't exhale until she hit the stairwell. Then she pulled her phone out and stared at Mason's last message, the one he'd sent at 3 a.m. from a place he couldn't name. 8 years married. 8 years of calendars that never lined up. 8 years of planning holidays around rotations and training blocks and last-minute changes that arrived with the casual cruelty of a form email. She'd stopped promising she'd make it up to him because she was tired of hearing her own voice say it. Mason didn't complain. That was part of what made it harder. He made jokes when he was tired and asked about her day like his day hadn't been worse. He carried responsibility in a way that looked steady from a distance and heavy up close. Their anniversary was in 17 days. Brooke drove to a grocery store off base after her shift and walked down aisles that smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. She picked up a boxed cake mix that promised something it had no right to promise. Warm, homemade, easy. She held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling slightly ridiculous and completely determined. Then she went to a jeweler in a strip mall where the air smelled like glass cleaner and velvet. She didn't ask for diamonds. She asked for simple. Something that could survive being worn under gloves and caught on a uniform sleeve and pressed into a palm during a goodbye that needed to last for months. The ring was plain silver, with 8 small hash marks carved on the inside band. She watched the engraver work through a loop and felt her throat tighten at the sight of those tiny lines, each one a year, each one a winter. When she walked out of the store, the day felt a degree brighter, like she'd stolen something back from the machine that kept turning their lives into schedules. The duffel came next. She laid it open on her bunk and packed it like she packed a trauma kit. Fast, efficient, nothing forgotten. Cold weather gear. Extra socks. Medical essentials. A small jar of frosting because the mess hall never stocked anything that didn't come in industrial quantities. The cake mix went in last, wedged at the bottom like a secret she couldn't afford to drop. On the morning she left, she didn't call Mason. She wanted his face when he saw her that split second before discipline kicked in, and he remembered he was on duty, that split second of surprise that belonged to them and no one else. The flight north felt longer than it should have. The transport plane was loud and cold and smelled like metal and old canvas. Brooke sat with her head against the wall, eyes half closed, listening to the vibration of the engine and the muted conversation of the handful of personnel rotating in. Someone cracked a joke about frostbite. Someone else laughed too hard. Brooke watched the ground change through a small window. The patchwork of cities and roads gave way to dark fields and frozen lakes that looked like bruises in the earth. The farther north they went, the less the world looked touched. It wasn't empty. It was quiet, the way a room is quiet before a difficult conversation. When they landed in Duluth, the air hit her like a slap. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it claimed. Brooke pulled her collar up and tightened her gloves, stepping onto tarmac that felt like it could crack. A National Guard van waited with an exhausted driver who checked names on a clipboard without looking up. "Halstead," he said finally, glancing at her face. "You're the nurse." "Yes," Brooke said. He nodded, like that explained why she'd be crazy enough to be here. The van's heater worked in short bursts. It coughed warm air for a moment, then fell silent. The ride out of the city took them past streetlights and gas stations, and then into roads that narrowed and darkened. Pines rose on either side, tall and heavy with snow. The sky was steel gray, low enough to make the world feel smaller. At one point, the van passed a frozen river. Brooke watched the ice the way it caught the thin light and thought about how a body would look under it. That thought came uninvited, the kind of clinical imagination she couldn't always shut off. She made herself think about cake instead, about frosting, about Mason laughing when he saw the box mix like she'd brought something priceless. The site wasn't a base in the way people pictured bases. It was a cluster of buildings tucked into the northern woods outside Ely. Prefab structures connected by narrow corridors. A low radar relay tower that cut into the horizon like a needle. A chain-link perimeter fence swallowed by drifts where the wind had decided to bury it. On paper, it was early warning infrastructure. In reality, it looked like a place the world forgot, and someone remembered just enough to keep funded. The gate opened slowly. A guard stepped out with a rifle slung loose, his shoulders raised against the cold. He waved the van through without much inspection. Brooke noticed that. Not as a paranoid thought, just a fact. She'd spent too many nights in hospitals watching how people grew casual around danger when nothing happened for long enough. The van stopped near the main admin building. Brooke stepped out, and her boots crunched into snow, hardened by days of sub-zero nights. The air stung her nose. Every breath felt sharp and clean, like it scraped her lungs on the way in. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the cold wake her fully, letting her eyes adjust to the whiteness. The woods pressed close. There was beauty here, the kind that made you quiet out of respect. The snow muffled everything. Even her thoughts felt softer. Too quiet, she thought. She almost smiled at herself for it. Overthinking was a professional hazard when your job was to anticipate what people's bodies would do at their worst. A voice cut through the air familiar enough that it shifted something deep in her chest. Brooke. She turned. Mason Halstead stood outside the communications trailer in a fleece cap and a heavy parka that made his shoulders look broader than they were. He was in the middle of arguing with a tech over a panel that blinked with a stubborn red warning light. His gloved hand was raised mid-gesture like he'd been explaining something for the third time. Then he saw her. The argument fell out of his face. The tension around his mouth softened. For an instant he looked younger than his rank, younger than the responsibility in his eyes. He crossed the packed snow in long strides, his boots sure on the ice. When he reached her, he didn't stop at a professional distance. He pulled her into him like the cold couldn't reach him anymore. "You weren't supposed to be here until next week," he said into her hair. Brooke breathed him in. Soap. Cold air. A faint smell of diesel that clung to everything out here. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder for half a second, long enough to feel the steadiness of him. "Paperwork miracle," she said, voice light. Mason laughed, but the laugh held exhaustion at the edges. He pulled back and looked at her properly, scanning her face like he needed proof she was real. "You're terrible at lying," he said. "I'm not lying," Brooke said. His smile deepened, then faded into something quieter. He looked older than 40 in this light. The Arctic gray didn't flatter anyone. It carved lines at the corners of his eyes and made the tiredness in his face harder to hide. "You're freezing," he said, though she wasn't. "Not yet." "It's fine," she said. "Come on," Mason said. "I'll get you checked in." He took her duffel like it weighed nothing, slinging it over his shoulder. Brooke's hand twitched toward it, out of instinct protective of the secret at the bottom. Mason didn't notice. Or he did, and pretended not to. He'd always been good at leaving space for her when she needed it. Inside the corridor, the heat hit them in a stale wave. The air smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, and the kind of industrial cleaner used in places that couldn't afford subtlety. The hallway was narrow. Pipes ran along the ceiling. Fluorescent lights flickered with a faint hum. "This place hasn't changed," Brooke said more to herself than him. Mason glanced at her. "You've been here before." Brooke kept walking, once, a long time ago. He didn't push. That was another reason she loved him. He knew when to ask and when to wait. He led her past the small medical room, the mess hall, the ops center where screens glowed with maps and data feeds. People looked up as they passed. A few nodded. Someone said, "Ma'am," with the polite curiosity people gave newcomers. Brooke smiled back and memorized faces automatically, a habit she couldn't turn off. Who was tired? Who was nervous? Who had a tremor in their hands that wasn't cold? A young specialist hurried by with a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. An older sergeant leaned against a wall and rubbed his shoulder, wincing as if he'd been sleeping on it wrong for a week. The base had the low hum of routine. That rhythm people fell into when nothing had gone wrong lately. They reached a small housing unit where Mason punched in a code. The door clicked. Inside was a room barely bigger than a hospital on-call space. Bunk, desk, a narrow closet, a small window crusted with ice. "Home sweet home," Mason said. Brooke set her bag down and shrugged out of her coat. Her hair crackled with static. Mason watched her like he was trying to adjust to the idea of her here. Her presence seemed to change the shape of the room, as if it reminded him there was a world outside this place. "You look tired," Brooke said. Mason scoffed softly. "I'm great." "You're not," Brooke said. He gave her a look that surrendered without admitting it. "We've been dealing with the signal issue for a week," he said. "Nothing major, just annoying. The kind of thing that makes everyone cranky." Brooke's gaze drifted to his hands. The knuckles were raw where gloves had rubbed. He'd been working more than he was sleeping. "Show me," she said. Mason hesitated. "You just got here." "I'm not asking for a tour," Brooke said. "I'm asking because I can see it's eating at you." He exhaled. "Fine, 5 minutes." He led her back toward the comms trailer. Outside, the wind sliced between buildings and found every gap in her clothing. The sky looked like it could snow at any moment. The tree line stood motionless, heavy with white. The tech at the panel was a staff sergeant named Collins. He looked up when Mason returned, and then did a double take when he saw Brooke. "Ma'am," Collins said. Brooke nodded. "Sergeant." Mason gestured to the screen. "We're getting intermittent drops on the perimeter feed and the radar relay signal. Not enough to trip alarms, just enough to make me want to throw this thing into the lake." Collins snorted. "Captain's being polite. It's been tripping all week." Brooke leaned closer, studying the readout. It wasn't her lane, not technically, but she knew what systems looked like when they were tired. She knew what stress did to things. People, machines, teams. Any pattern, she asked. Collins shrugged. "Hard to tell. Could be weather. Could be wildlife setting off sensors. Could be a connection upstream." Mason rubbed a hand over his face. "We put in a ticket. Higher just tells us to reset and monitor." Brooke glanced at the base perimeter beyond the trailer. Snow drifted against the fence in uneven mounds. The north side disappeared into woods that looked endless. "You've got a full watch rotation?" Brooke asked. Mason's eyes flicked to her. "We do." That pause told her what his words didn't. They had rotation, but it wasn't full, not really, not enough for comfort. Brooke nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "I'll let you fight your machines." Mason's mouth twitched. "Thank you." As they walked back, Brooke's gaze caught a motion sensor housing near the north fence line. A plastic cover sat slightly askew. A crack ran down the side like a thin lightning bolt. It wasn't catastrophic. It was the kind of damage people wrote off as wear and tear cold stress a careless boot. Brooke stopped. Mason turned. "What?" She pointed. "That sensor casing." Mason followed her line of sight. "Yeah, we saw it. Maintenance is on the list." "On the list," Brooke repeated. "It's been cold," Mason said. "Plastic gets brittle." Brooke nodded like she agreed because maybe she did. Or maybe she didn't like how casual it sounded. She hated that she couldn't tell which feeling was professional instinct and which was the part of her that never stopped scanning for threats. She forced herself to keep walking. In the mess hall later, the base served lunch that tasted like it had been reheated more times than anyone wanted to admit. Brooke sat across from Mason at a small table bolted to the floor. The room was warm enough to make her cheeks sting as they thawed. Mason's knee bounced under the table. He was eating quickly, eyes flicking toward the door every time someone entered. Brooke watched him the way she watched patients who pretended they weren't in pain. She could see how his mind kept running even when his body was still. She reached across and took his hand. Mason looked down at their joined fingers like he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without urgency. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. Brooke squeezed. "Me too." It would have been easy to tell him then, to pull out the ring, to watch his face shift into that soft disbelief she loved. But the timing felt wrong. Not because of anything obvious. Because the room felt slightly off like a chord that didn't resolve. Across the room, two soldiers argued about the perimeter feed. One was young enough to still have roundness in his cheeks. The other had the tense posture of someone who'd been stuck in places like this too many times. "It's been tripping all week," the younger one said. "Probably deer." "Deer don't walk like that," the older one replied. "You think it's what, aliens?" The older one's mouth tightened. "I think it's something." The younger one scoffed. "It's Minnesota. It's snow and boredom. That's what it is." Brooke sipped her coffee. It was burnt, bitter brewed too long and kept warm too long. She stared out the frosted window toward the northern ridge. Snow sat heavy on branches, making them sag. The white seemed endless, unbroken. The kind of snow that muffled sound, she thought. The kind of snow that let things move without being heard. She hated that her brain went there. She hated that a part of her felt more awake in discomfort. Mason leaned forward. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" Brooke blinked and looked at him. "Yeah." He didn't look convinced. "Just tired," Brooke added. Mason nodded like he understood. "I can't take leave," he said, as if that had been weighing on him. "Not right now." Brooke's mouth curved gently. "I didn't come for leave," she said. "I came for dinner." He smiled relief, easing something in his shoulders. "Does the mess hall oven still work?" Brooke asked, forcing lightness. Mason laughed. "It works. It just smells like diesel and reheated coffee. So your cake's going to taste like a mechanic's glove." "That's fine," Brooke said. "That's the flavor of love." Mason shook his head amused, then sobered. "We'll do it tonight," he said. "After shift change. I'll get you a couple hours where nobody bothers me." "Nobody bothers you," Brooke repeated. "Okay," Mason said. "Nobody bothers me on purpose." Brooke watched him eat. Watched the way his eyes kept tracking the room. The way his jaw tightened when a radio on the wall crackled and then went quiet. She realized he was listening even when he pretended not to be. After lunch, Mason got pulled back into the ops center. Brooke followed him halfway, then stopped at the door when he looked at her. "Get settled," he said. "Rest. You've been traveling." Brooke nodded. "Go," she said. "Do your captain thing." Mason gave her a look that was half fond, half tired. "I'll come find you." Brooke walked back toward the housing unit, taking the longer route outside because the cold cleared her head. She moved slowly, boots crunching on packed snow. A soldier passed her hauling a crate of supplies. Another leaned against a building and smoked quickly, fingers bare for a few seconds despite the cold. The smell of tobacco cut through the clean air like a memory. Near the fuel depot, Brooke noticed something else. The gate was open. The padlock hung loose, swung slightly by the wind. A guard post stood empty, chair tucked under a small awning. It could have been a normal moment between shifts, a gap that meant nothing. Brooke stopped again. She looked around. No one nearby. The woods watched silently. She waited for a count of 5, then another 5. Still no guard. It was nothing, she told herself. A bathroom break, a shift change. But she didn't like it. She walked on without saying anything. Mason had enough on his shoulders. She had come here to give him relief, not add weight. She repeated that in her head like a mantra until it almost worked. Back in her room, Brooke unpacked with methodical precision. She stowed medical gear, folded uniforms, hung cold weather layers. The cake mix stayed in the duffel. The ring stayed in her pocket. Every time her fingers touched it, she felt a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She sat on the bunk and listened to the bass. The faint hum of generators, the muffled voices in the corridor, a door closing, boots, laughter that sounded forced, life continuing in a small place where life always had to continue. Brooke leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Her mind tried to run through worst-case scenarios the way it always did. She shut it down. She forced herself to picture Mason's face when she gave him the ring. The way he'd pretend to be annoyed she'd spent money. The way his eyes would soften anyway. She must have drifted for a short time because when she opened her eyes, the light outside had shifted. Late afternoon. The sky darker now, heavy with incoming snow. A knock came at the door. Brooke sat up. "Come in." Mason stepped inside, cheeks red from cold eyes, tired. He looked like he'd been fighting something all day that didn't show on a battlefield map. How bad, Brooke asked. Mason shut the door behind him and leaned against it like he needed the support. "Not bad," he said automatically. Then he sighed. Annoying. The radar relay glitched again. "You fixed it." "We reset it," Mason said. "Which is what we always do." Brooke studied him. "You don't like that answer." Mason's mouth tightened. "No." Brooke stood and crossed to him. She slid her hands up his arms, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders even through layers. "You're carrying too much," she said. Mason's eyes closed for a brief moment. When he opened them, there was something vulnerable there. "I'm responsible for this place," he said. 20-something people. 1 tower, 1 relay, 1 perimeter fence that's more snow than chain link right now. If anything goes wrong, it's on me." Brooke pressed her forehead to his for a second. "You're not alone," she said. Mason laughed softly, humorless. "It feels like it out here sometimes." Brooke pulled back and smiled. "Then let's make it feel less like that," she said. "Dinner, cake, anniversary practice run." Mason's mouth curved. "Practice run." Brooke reached into her duffel and pulled out the cake mix, holding it up like a trophy. Mason stared, then laughed, for real this time. It started low, then grew, shaking some of the tension loose. "You flew out here with cake mix," he said. Brooke lifted her chin. "I flew out here with love." Mason stepped forward and kissed her slow and deliberate, like he was reminding himself this was real. "All right," he said when they parted. "Let's do it." They walked to the mess hall together. Brooke carried the box mix and frosting. Mason carried a small bag of supplies he'd scavenged from the kitchen staff. Eggs, a stick of butter. The mess hall smelled like old grease and detergent. The oven sat against the wall like a tired machine that still did its job. A cook on duty raised an eyebrow when he saw them. "Captain," the cook said, "you baking now?" Mason lifted a hand. "Don't start." Brooke smiled. "It's an anniversary thing." The cook's expression softened just a fraction. "Oven runs hot," he said. "Watch it." Brooke nodded. "Got it." She mixed batter in a metal bowl, stirring with a spoon that had seen more mashed potatoes than cake. The batter was pale and thick. The kitchen light made it look slightly gray. Brooke tried to laugh at the absurdity of it, at the idea of romance in a place that smelled like diesel. Mason leaned against the counter and watched her like she was the most normal thing he'd seen all day. "You look different here," he said. "Different," how Brooke asked, scraping batter into a pan. "Like you belong," Mason said. "Not like you're visiting." Brooke paused. Her fingers tightened around the spoon. "I'm visiting," she said lightly. Mason's gaze held hers. He didn't look convinced. Brooke slid the pan into the oven and shut the door. "How long?" Mason asked. 30 minutes, Brooke said. "If this oven doesn't decide to act like a furnace." Mason checked his watch. "I've got 15, he said. "Then I need to check the perimeter before shift change." Brooke turned toward him. "It's that kind of day." Mason nodded. "It's that kind of week." Brooke leaned her hip against the counter. "Tell me," she said. "Not the captain version, the Mason version." Mason's jaw worked. He looked down at his hands, then back up. "The feed drops, the sensors trip. Nothing consistent. Just enough to make everyone edgy," he said. "And I can't tell if it's the system or the people." Brooke watched him carefully. "People doing what?" "Getting sloppy," Mason said. "Because it's cold, and they're tired, and it's been quiet for months. They leave a door unlatched. They take the long way around because it's warmer. They assume the glitch is deer because it's always deer until it isn't." Brooke felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with Minnesota. She kept her face calm. "Have you reported it up the chain?" she asked. Mason's mouth tightened again. "I've filed tickets. I've sent notes," he said. "You know how it goes. It's a small site. We're not a priority unless we become a problem." Brooke nodded slowly. "And you're trying not to become a problem." Mason's eyes met hers, agly. The oven ticked faintly as it heated. The mess hall's radio in the corner hummed with static. Brooke listened to it without thinking, the way she listened to monitors in an ICU. A change in rhythm meant something, even if no one else noticed. Mason reached across the counter and took her hand. His palm was warm in his glove. "I'm glad you're here," he said again, softer this time. Brooke swallowed. "Me too." For a moment, the base felt far away. It was just them, a box mix cake, their hands. The idea that they still had the ability to make a small ritual out of a hard life. Then the radio crackled once sharp enough to make Brooke's head lift. A voice tried to come through, broken by interference. The sound cut off mid-breath, and the room fell back into its artificial warmth. The cook didn't look up. Mason didn't move. It was the kind of interruption everyone had learned to ignore because it happened too often. Brooke's fingers tightened around Mason's hand anyway. Outside, somewhere beyond the mess hall walls, the wind shifted, and the snow pressed closer to the fence line as if it were trying to hide the world. The oven gave off a tired metallic heat that smelled faintly of old grease and scorched sugar. Brooke kept her fingers wrapped around Mason's hand a second longer than necessary, as if she could hold the moment in place by sheer pressure. "You heard that," she said quietly. Mason's eyes flicked toward the radio, then away. He forced a small smile. "Static happens all the time." Brooke didn't argue. She had learned that pushing a soldier to admit unease only made them bury it deeper. Instead, she turned back to the oven, watching the thin seam of light along the door like it might change shape. The cook slapped a tray down on the counter and muttered something about inventory. Somewhere in the corridor outside, boots moved past with the steady rhythm of routine. The base hummed like it always did, machines working, people moving, nothing collapsing. Brooke breathed in through her nose. The air tasted warm and stale compared to the cold outside. She tried to let herself settle. Mason squeezed her hand and let go. 15, he said, tapping his watch. "I'll be back before your masterpiece turns into a brick." "It's going to be a brick," Brooke said. Mason leaned in and kissed her cheek, then stepped away. The door to the mess hall swung shut behind him. His absence left a thin, unexpected ache in her chest. Brooke stayed near the counter, wiping batter from the spoon with a paper towel. She listened. A distant generator whine, the tick of the oven thermostat, the faint hiss of the radio. Then the sound changed. Not louder. different, like someone had taken the steady background hum and scraped it sideways. The radio hiss sharpened into a more aggressive static, a tearing noise that made Brooke's skin prickle. The cook finally looked up. "You messing with that thing?" he asked, irritation covering a flicker of concern. Brooke shook her head. "No." The static peaked, then dropped into silence so sudden it felt like pressure leaving a room. The radio went dead, not even a soft hum remaining. Brooke set the spoon down carefully. In her mind, a monitor line flattened. Across the mess hall, two soldiers who had been arguing earlier paused mid-sentence. One of them glanced toward the window. The other tilted his head as if listening for a sound that should be there. The first explosion hit at 1340. It was not cinematic. It was not a fireball. It was a deep, blunt concussion that made the mess hall lights flicker and sent a vibration through the floor. A tray clattered off a table. Coffee sloshed onto someone's sleeve. For half a second, everyone froze in the same shared disbelief bodies caught between routine and emergency. Then the base alarm wailed a harsh tone that carried none of the gentle cadence of a drill. This was the kind of sound meant to cut through thought. The cook swore, "That's not scheduled." No one laughed. A second blast hit a heartbeat later, closer, sharper, and this one came with the sound of tearing metal. The walls shook. Frost flaked from the window frame. A voice over a handheld radio, distorted and frantic, pushed through someone's speaker. "Contact north. North fence breach. Contact north." Brooke moved before her brain finished naming what was happening. Her hands went to her pockets, checking for gloves, checking for the small trauma kit she always carried even when she told herself she was off duty. Her body knew the sequence. The mess hall door flew open and a private stumbled in, face white eyes wide. "They're in," he gasped. "They're in the perimeter." Brooke grabbed his arm. "Where is medical setup?" The private blinked. "Aid station, west corridor." "Go," Brooke said, pushing him toward the door. "Get med supplies moving. Litters, tourniquets, now." He stared at her like he needed permission to breathe, then he ran. Gunfire cracked outside, crisp and controlled. Not panicked, not random. Bursts spaced with discipline like someone was counting in their head. The sound echoed differently, in the cold, sharp and flat, as if the air refused to carry it properly. Brooke cut through the corridor toward the west side. People spilled into hallways, some running, some frozen. All of them suddenly aware of how small this place was. A young specialist pressed himself against a wall, clutching a radio that spat only static. "Comms are gone," he said to no one. "Comms are jammed." Another explosion rolled through the compound. The lights flickered again and held. Brooke pushed past a knot of soldiers near the ops center. Through the doorway, she saw screens glitching, maps freezing mid-refresh, a radar sweep stuttering into broken fragments. A sergeant shouted, "Get off the main room. Move to secondary positions." Brooke's throat tightened. Mason. She turned hard and ran toward the perimeter corridor, boots slipping slightly on the polished floor. She forced herself to breathe slow and controlled because a fast breath in cold air made your chest burn and your hands shake. When she hit the outer door, the cold punched her face. Snow stung her cheeks. Smoke rose in a thick column from the north side where the fence line should have been. The wind carried the smell of burning insulation and diesel. Gunfire snapped overhead. A round hit metal somewhere nearby with a sharp ping. Brooke crouched instinctively behind a concrete barrier and scanned the yard. Soldiers were scrambling to positions, slipping in snow as they tried to find cover. Return fire came in uneven bursts, reactive, less coordinated. The attackers had elevation and tempo. Brooke saw two bodies down near the outer barrier. One was crawling, leaving a thin red trail across the white ground. The sight made her stomach drop and her hands steady at the same time. She ran low to the first casualty, sliding into the snow. A young man, maybe 19, eyes huge with shock, blood soaking his sleeve. He tried to speak, and only a wet sound came out. "Look at me," Brooke said, voice firm. "Stay with me. Where are you hit?" He swallowed hard. "Arm, I think. I can't feel my hand." Brooke ripped open his sleeve with a gloved hand. Blood was pumping from a jagged wound near the elbow. She pressed down hard fingers finding the artery, then pulled a pressure bandage from her kit. "You can feel your fingers?" she asked. He shook his head, teeth chattering. "Focus on my voice," Brooke said. She wrapped and tightened until the bleeding slowed. "You're going to be okay, you hear me?" He nodded too fast. A soldier dropped beside her. "Ma'am, who are you?" Medical, Brooke said. "Get him to the aid station. Keep this pressure. Do not loosen it." The soldier grabbed the casualty under the arms and started dragging him back. Brooke rose and moved toward the second downed figure. A mortar impact hit near the motor pool, sending up a flash and a roar. Heat washed across the yard. A Humvee caught fire, black smoke coiling upward into the gray sky. Someone screamed into a radio, the sound distorted. "We need eyes on the ridge. They've got overwatch." Brooke's gaze snapped toward the tree line above the north perimeter. Through the falling snow, she could see movement, dark shapes against white, too purposeful to be animals. The bursts of gunfire came from 3 distinct points overlapping, pinning defenders in a shallow kill zone between buildings and the fence line. She recognized it with a kind of sick clarity. Whoever was up there understood terrain. Her breath caught as she spotted Mason near a group of defenders, posture forward, arm raised as he shouted orders. He was moving with the controlled urgency of someone trying to stop panic from spreading. He pointed toward a secondary barrier line directing a squad to shift. Brooke started toward him. A sound sliced the air different from the others. Not a burst, not a pop. A single sharp crack that snapped like a whip in cold air. Mason's body jerked. His arm dropped mid-gesture. For a fraction of a second he stayed upright, as if his brain hadn't accepted what his body already knew. Then his legs folded and he went down hard into the snow. Brooke didn't remember deciding to run. She was moving, sliding, scrambling her world, narrowing to the shape of him on the ground. "Mason," she said, but the word didn't feel like enough. She dropped beside him. Blood spread fast through the snow beneath his thigh, too dark, too much. The wound was high upper leg, the kind that could empty a man in minutes. Mason's face was pale under his cap. His eyes found hers clear even through pain. "Brooke," he rasped, breath fogging. "Don't talk," she said. Her hands were already working. Gloves slick with blood, fingers pressing hard into the wound to find the source. Warmth bled through cold, shocking against her skin. She pulled out a tourniquet and wrapped it higher than felt reasonable, because this was not a wound you negotiated with. She cinched it and twisted the windlass until the bleeding slowed, until Mason's jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his face jumped. He grabbed her sleeve. His grip was strong for someone losing blood. "Hold the line," he whispered. Even now, that was what he cared about. Brooke leaned in close. "You're going to live," she said, voice flat with certainty. It was not comfort. It was an order. She checked distal pulse at his ankle. Nothing. Her eyes flicked up, then back down. She didn't allow herself to react. Reaction wasted time. "Stretcher," she shouted loud enough to cut through gunfire. "Now, move." A young medic skidded in beside her, eyes wide with that raw fear that comes when training meets reality. "Ma'am," he stammered. "You," Brooke said, shoving a hemostatic dressing into his hands. "Pack the wound when I lift. Hard, deep, do not hesitate." The medic swallowed and nodded. Brooke lifted pressure just enough. The medic stuffed the gauze into the wound with shaking hands, then steadied when Brooke placed her hand over his and pushed down together. "Good," Brooke said. "Hold that pressure, don't let go." Gunfire cracked close enough that snow kicked up beside them. Someone fired back from behind a barrier. The attackers responded with disciplined bursts, walking rounds across the yard. The medic looked up, panic flooding his face. "We need to move him." "We are," Brooke said. "2 people, on my count." 2 soldiers rushed in with a litter, faces, strained breath fogging. Brooke gave them quick instructions, then helped lift Mason onto the stretcher. Mason's hand caught hers again, fingers cold through the glove. He tried to speak. Brooke shook her head once a silent command. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again, stubborn. Brooke leaned close to his ear. "I'm right here," she said. "You're not alone." The stretcher team began pulling him back toward the aid station. Brooke stood slowly. For a moment, she felt the battlefield widen again, noise flooding back into her ears. Alarm, shouts, the thump of mortars, the crack of rifles. Her body wanted to follow Mason. Her mind did something else. It started mapping. 3 primary firing points on the North Ridge. Overlapping fields. Suppression from elevation. A deliberate breach at the north fence. Comms jammed to delay outside response. Mortar impacts placed to ignite vehicles and create smoke confusion and blocked movement. They were shaping the defenders, herding them inward. Someone yelled, "Fall back to central structures." Fall back. Brooke watched a cluster of soldiers begin retreating toward the heart of the compound. The instinct made sense. Buildings felt safe. Walls felt solid. But walls made easy targets for mortars. If they collapsed inward, the attackers would tighten the net. One accurate tube adjustment and the aid station, the ops center, the housing units, all of it could become a single bloody room. Brooke's mouth went dry. She looked at the ridge again. The gunfire pattern was not random. It had rhythm, a heavy weapon anchoring the tempo, another element moving between bursts, repositioning, a third calling the timing. It was teamwork. It was professional. And the base was losing ground. Static hissed from open radios. No clear command voice, just fragments. "Where's Overwatt? I can't see them." "North fence, north fence." Brooke's hands flexed, fingers stiffening from cold and adrenaline. She felt something old stir under her ribs. Not anger, not fear. Something colder and more precise. She turned her head and spotted the armory building near the comms shed. A dark rectangle against the snow, its door half rimmed with ice. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She was a nurse. She was here with cake mix. Another burst of gunfire snapped overhead, and a defender fell near the barrier, dropping like his strings had been cut. Brooke didn't think about cake anymore. She ran. The snow grabbed at her boots. A round cracked somewhere behind her, close enough that she felt the air move. She kept low, using smoke and drifting snow as cover, moving between structures the way someone moved when they knew where the angles were. She hit the armory door and yanked it open. Warmth did not greet her. The interior was cold metal and oil smell rifles in racks, boxes of ammunition stacked like bricks. A young sergeant inside spun toward her, eyes alarmed. "Ma'am, this is restricted." He started, then stopped when he saw her face. Brooke crossed to the rack without ceremony. An M110 sat partially disassembled from a training drill, upper receiver separated, bolt out, optic loose. Her hands went to it like they had been waiting for permission. She checked the bolt, checked the chamber reassembled with efficient movements. The pieces fit with the quiet click of familiarity. She mounted the scope, tightened screws with quick precision, ran the charging handle, felt the weapon settle into readiness. The sergeant stared at her like she had just spoken a language he didn't know. "Ma'am," he said again, voice rising, "that's not standard issue for medical." Brooke didn't look at him. She slid a magazine and tugged to confirm it seated, then slung the rifle. Outside, the alarm wailed. Another mortar thumped closer now. The building shivered. The sergeant stepped in front of her path. "Where are you going?" Brooke finally met his eyes. "Buying you time," she said, and the words came out calm, almost gentle. He swallowed. "You even qualified on that." Brooke's gaze flicked past him to the ridgeline. "Move your people out of the open," she said instead. The sergeant hesitated, then made a decision. He stepped aside and nodded once. "South Ridge gives you an angle," he said quickly. "Halfway up there's a rock shelf." Brooke nodded like she already knew. She pushed out the door into the cold again, rifle weight pulling at her shoulder breath, steadying. Snow and smoke merged into a gray curtain that erased depth and distance. The radar relay tower flickered in the distance, then went dark, its lights dying like a heartbeat stopping. Comms were still jammed. Outside help would be late. The base had only what it had. Brooke sprinted low across the yard while a squad laid suppressive fire toward the ridge. Bullets snapped behind her boots. A round hit a metal pole and sent a shard of ice scattering. She did not look back. Looking back made you slow. She reached the southern slope and started climbing. The incline was slick with ice beneath powder snow. She used her hands when she had to, digging fingers into crusted drifts, feeling cold burn through gloves. Her lungs pulled in air that cut like glass. She kept her breathing controlled anyway, forcing each inhale to be slow, each exhale longer. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Halfway up, she found the shelf the sergeant had mentioned, a narrow ledge carved into rock, just wide enough to go prone. She dropped onto her stomach, the rifle settling into the snow. Her forearm swept powder aside. The metal was already cold against her cheek. She raised the scope, and the world narrowed. The north ridge sharpened into clarity. Dark figures moved between trees using fallen timber and rock as concealment. They were not amateurs. They kept low. They worked in coordination, and they owned the geometry of the terrain. Brooke's mind clicked through variables: range, wind, cold air density. She felt the gusts on her face and translated them into drift without needing to name the math. A heavy weapon team anchored the assault. She saw the muzzle flash the controlled bursts. The gunner paused after a string shifting the barrel, a routine practiced under stress. Brooke watched that rhythm, 7 rounds. Then a pause. She waited for the pause the way you wait for a pulse to return. Below her, the base teetered. Defenders hugged barriers too low to stop rounds coming from above. Someone dragged a casualty toward the aid station, leaving a trail of blood that looked obscene on fresh snow. Brooke's eyes flicked once toward the yard. She caught a glimpse of Mason's stretcher, moving, his face pale against the white. His mouth opened, as if he were still trying to give orders. Her jaw tightened. Back to the scope. The gunner's barrel changed. The pause arrived. Brooke exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs until the world seemed to still. She took the slack out of the trigger. The rifle cracked sharp and flat, and the sound vanished into wind. Through the scope, she saw the Overwatch gunner jerk backward. The machine gun slipped sideways off its support. For a split second, nothing else changed. The other attackers kept firing, unaware their anchor had just disappeared. Then the rhythm faltered. Bursts lost timing. The kill zone loosened. Defenders below lifted their heads half an inch, sensing relief before understanding it. Someone shouted, voice raw with disbelief. "They're off tempo." Brooke worked the bolt smoothly. No wasted motion. No triumphant breath. She found the next target. Lower on the ridge, partially concealed behind rock and drift, a figure threw hand signals. A team leader. The one shaping movement, calling adjustments, keeping their coordination from splintering. He stood to relocate, scanning for the source of the shot that broke their dominance. That was his mistake. Brooke adjusted for a gust that had shifted, led the shot into the wind, and pressed again. He folded mid-step, collapsing into snow that swallowed him fast. Below, defenders surged, not recklessly, but with that quiet forward movement that happens when pressure lifts and breathing becomes possible again. A squad shifted east, covering each other, reclaiming a few yards of ground that had felt impossible moments earlier. Brooke stayed on the ridge cheek to stalk, eyes steady. Her fingers were stiff from cold, but her trigger discipline remained smooth. Now, the attackers knew something had changed. Fire redirected toward the southern ridge in scattered arcs. Wild guesses. Snow kicked up near Brooke's position, close enough to sting her face, but not close enough to matter. They had a direction. They did not have precision. Brooke shifted 10 feet along the rock shelf, flattening her silhouette. She adjusted her angle and reacquired the ridge. A third figure knelt near the fallen leader, reaching for a handset that lay half buried. The radio operator. The voice that kept their tempo aligned. Brooke, centered crosshairs, waited for a fraction of a second, until the figure committed to the movement and fired. The handset tumbled into the snow, useless. Coordination dissolved into fragments. The assault that had been synchronized became individual survival. Fragments could still kill. A round snapped close to the ridge edge. Brooke didn't flinch. She searched for the next threat. Near the lower tree line, she spotted it. A mortar crew trying to reposition the tube after losing direction from above. If they found their range again, one accurate round into the center of the base could undo everything. Brooke's breathing slowed further. She recalculated quickly for angle change. She exhaled until her lungs emptied and the world narrowed to crosshair and heartbeat. She fired. The bullet struck the sight assembly, first shattering glass. The crew scattered. One dropped, one crawled, the third flailed in confusion. Brooke did not chase every shadow. She selected only the ones that could shift outcome. Below, the base regained spine. Soldiers moved in coordinated pairs, covering each other, reclaiming the fence line foot by foot. The smoke from the motor pool drifted, then thinned as wind shifted. Brooke took another measured shot at a shooter attempting to flank east, disabling him before he could get behind the defenders. She pinned down a figure dragging equipment toward retreat vehicles hidden beyond the ridge crest. The assault began to break. You could feel it in the way return fire turned sporadic reactive instead of deliberate. The attackers started to move like people being hunted. Brooke stopped firing for nearly 30 seconds. That silence did more than another round would have. It made them guess. It made them hesitate. It made every open step feel like a decision that could end them. Down below, someone signaled that the north perimeter was partially secured. A voice shouted that medevac was inbound, though the sky looked empty and the radio still spat static. Brooke tracked movement retreating beyond the ridge crest. She saw snow camo transport shapes waiting on the far side engines, likely running ready to pull out. She could take them. Some of them. Enough to feel like justice. She didn't. 2 operators moved awkwardly, dragging one of their wounded. Brooke kept the crosshairs on the lead man's back and let him go. She watched him vanish into the white, carrying fear like a contagion. She held position for another full minute, scanning for deception, for bait, for a counter-sniper setting up to find her glint. Nothing moved. Only then did she save the rifle. When she descended the ridge, her legs shook from cold and adrenaline crash. The base looked smaller from ground level, quieter in a way that made the aftermath feel unreal. Smoke still rose from the motor pool. Snow fell lightly again, trying to cover what had happened. Soldiers moved with purpose now. Triage near the aid station. Perimeter reinforcement. Casualty count. The base commander shouted clipped orders, voice strained but steady. They looked at Brooke differently as she approached. Not awe, not yet. Confusion first, then something like understanding that the person walking toward them was not who they thought she was. Brooke handed the rifle to the sergeant outside the armory without explanation. Her hands were bloodless now. Fingers numb, but her posture stayed composed. She walked straight into the aid station. Inside, the air was warmer and smelled of antiseptic and iron. A medic was cutting away uniforms with trauma shears. Someone was crying quietly in a corner, not loud enough to draw attention, but loud enough to be real. Mason lay on a table, pale jaw, clenched eyes open. The tourniquet was still high on his thigh. Gauze was packed deep into the wound. Blood stained the sheet beneath him. A surgical team from the small medical unit worked fast hands, moving in practiced coordination. There were no theatrics, only urgency. Brooke stepped in, and her eyes assessed instantly. The entry wound was high, tissue damage extensive, the kind of injury that made saving life possible and saving limb unlikely. A medic glanced up. "Ma'am, we're trying to." "I know," Brooke said softly. She moved to Mason's side, careful not to get in the way. Her gloved hand found his forearm. Mason's gaze latched onto her. Even through shock, he tried to speak. Brooke leaned close. "Breathe," she said. "In, out, stay with me." His eyes searched hers, and in them she saw pride and confusion braided together. He had felt the shift in the fight. He knew the base had held. He did not know how. Brooke's throat tightened. She kept her face calm. A surgeon's voice cut through the room. "We've got major vascular damage. We need him airborne as soon as possible." A medic nodded sharply. "Bird's on the way." Brooke's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, just long enough to accept the reality that was already written in the blood on the table. He would live. The leg would not. She opened her eyes and met Mason's gaze again. "We held," he whispered, voice rough. Brooke squeezed his arm. "Yes," she said. The word was true enough to carry him through the next minutes. Outside, rotors began to beat the air deep and heavy, the sound building until it pressed against the walls. The base had survived long enough for help to land, and the yard beyond, the aid station, filled with a new kind of tension, not from incoming fire, but from the arrival of men who had expected to save a base and instead walked into a place already saved. The rotors grew from a distant thrum into a physical force, a pounding that shook loose snow from roof lines and drove it into spirals across the yard. The aid station's thin walls vibrated. Loose metal rattled on a shelf. A medic braced a hand against the table as if the sound itself could knock the room over. Brooke stayed beside Mason as long as there was something useful she could do. When the surgeon shifted him, when they cut away the last of his uniform and worked with the hard, clean focus that trauma demanded, Brooke stepped back half a pace, giving them space without leaving. Mason's eyes tracked her anyway. He was fighting the same battle she'd seen in 100 patients. The urge to ask questions he did not want answered. The stubborn need to stay in control of a situation that no longer belonged to him. His hand found her wrist again as the team prepared to move him. "Brooke," he said, breath thin, "you good?" It was not a question. It was his way of trying to protect her, even now his way of refusing to let the moment take something else. Brooke looked down at him and let her face soften for just a second. "I'm here," she said. "That's all you need." His grip tightened, then weakened as sedation started to tug at the edges of his focus. He blinked slowly, eyes glossy. Brooke held his gaze anyway, steadying him with presence when she could not steady him with promises. The stretcher team rolled him toward the door. A medic adjusted the tourniquet one last time, checking pressure. Another strapped an IV bag tight to the frame so it would not swing. Mason's face remained set, jaw clenched hard enough to make the muscles jump. As he passed Brooke, his fingers caught her sleeve and held for a heartbeat, as if he could anchor himself to her body through fabric. "Hold," he murmured, barely audible. Brooke nodded once. She did not trust her voice. If she spoke, it might break. He was carried into the cold toward the sound of rotors, toward an aircraft that would swallow him and lift him away. Brooke followed to the threshold and watched the stretcher disappear into the snow and blowing wind. Outside, the air was chaos again, but a different kind of chaos. Not incoming fire. The chaos of aftermath. Men shouting over rotors, medics running with litters, security teams moving to reinforce what had been reclaimed. Smoke from the motor pool smeared the sky in a dark ribbon. The helicopter sat in the yard like an animal, gray and heavy rotors beating the snow into violent circles. A crew chief stood at the open door, one hand gripping the frame, eyes scanning the perimeter with practiced suspicion. Brooke stepped out, and her boots sank into churned snow. The cold hit her face hard, sharp enough to wake her fully. Her breath came out in white bursts, steady, controlled. She watched Mason being loaded into the aircraft. His body looked too still on the stretcher. The blanket over his legs was pulled up tight. The tourniquet stood out like a brutal band of truth. He turned his head toward her as they slid him inside. Their eyes met through the storm of rotor wash. Mason's expression held pride, confusion, and something unfinished. He wanted answers. He wanted to ask the question that had been forming in his mind since the perimeter held and the gunfire tempo broke. He could not shape it with his mouth. Brooke gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "Stay alive," the kind that said, "I am not leaving." The helicopter lifted. The skids rose slowly at first, then the aircraft climbed, nose turning slightly into the wind. Snow spun in its wake and then settled again in a thin, drifting curtain. Brooke stood and watched until the bird became a darker shape against the pale sky, and then a dot swallowed by distance. Only when it vanished did she feel her shoulders drop a fraction. A hand touched her arm. Brooke turned, instantly alert. A young medic stood beside her, the one she had handed Mason to. His face was still tight with adrenaline. His gloves were stained. His eyes looked at her like she was both familiar and impossible. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "he's gonna make it." Brooke nodded. "Yes." The medic swallowed. We didn't have comms. We didn't have radar. We were getting crushed. Then it just changed, like someone turned the pressure off. Brooke said nothing. The medic glanced toward the ridge. That was you, wasn't it? Brooke's gaze followed his landing on the distant line of trees and rock where the fight had shifted. I did what I had to, she said. The medic hesitated. I'm sorry, he blurted as if apologizing for asking. It's just, I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen someone pick targets like that. Like you could see the whole board. Brooke studied him, taking in the youth under the uniform, the fear he would carry later when the noise stopped, and his mind replayed it. You did your job, she said instead. You held pressure. You didn't freeze. That matters. His jaw worked. He wanted to say more. He did not know how. A sergeant's voice cut across the yard. Medical, I need triage on the west side. 2 walking wounded, 1 not walking. Brooke turned toward the call. Her body moved without hesitation. She crossed the yard at a brisk pace, scanning as she went. Smoke still rose from the motor pool. A burned vehicle sat half-collapsed, tires melted into dark shapes. Snow around it had turned gray and wet. Men dragged equipment away from the wreckage, moving quickly, speaking in clipped bursts. A base commander stood near the ops building, face pale, eyes wide, trying to project calm while his world shook. He held a radio to his mouth even though it produced only static, as if stubbornness could make technology obey. Brooke passed him and headed toward the west side where medics had established a triage point with folding tables and emergency blankets. The area looked improvised, but the movement had purpose now. That was how you could tell the base had survived. Not because the shooting had stopped, but because people had regained the ability to think. 2 soldiers sat on the ground, backs against a wall. One clutched his shoulder where blood seeped through a torn jacket. The other held his hand out, fingers, red eyes, glassy with shock. Brooke dropped to a knee. Talk to me, she said to the one with the shoulder wound. Where are you hit? Shrapnel, he said, teeth clenched. Feels like it's on fire. Brooke pulled his jacket open with gloved hands. The wound was ugly, but not catastrophic. She pressed assessed depth, then nodded to a medic. Clean and dress, she said. Watch for bleeding under the skin. He's going to swell. She turned to the second soldier. Hand, she said. Let me see. He extended his fingers, a deep cut across the palm, blood pulsing with each heartbeat. Brooke's voice stayed calm. You can still move them. He flexed shakily. Good, she said. You're going to keep that. Hold pressure. She wrapped his hand tight, then looked up as a stretcher team ran past, carrying someone unconscious. A trail of blood dotted the snow like spilled ink. Brooke followed. The casualty was a private with a chest wound, breath, shallow lips turning gray. Brooke slid beside him. How long ago? 2 minutes, a medic answered. Brooke pressed a hand to the wound, feeling air suck through the tissue. She grabbed a chest seal, slapped it into place, then listened to breath sounds. The right side was weaker. Tension risk, she said, eyes narrowing. Get me a needle. A medic fumbled, then produced one. Brooke inserted it with precise movement, a small hiss of escaping pressure answering her like a confession. The private's chest rose a fraction easier. His eyes flickered open, unfocused. Brooke leaned close. Stay with me, she said. You're not done. She worked like this for minutes that blurred together. Move, assess, stop bleeding, protect airway, keep people warm. Cold killed almost as quickly as blood loss out here. She watched fingers for frostbite. She rubbed warmth into hands with her own when needed. She barked instructions without raising her voice. Around her, the base reorganized itself from panic into process. Security teams shifted to reinforce the north perimeter. A squad moved toward the damaged fence line with rolls of concertina wire. Another checked the tree line with optics, wary of movement. A few soldiers stared at the ridge as if it might rise up again and start shooting. Brooke did not allow herself to stare. Not yet. A corporal approached with a tablet. Ma'am, he said, out of breath, we've got drone footage from our small quad. It got a quick sweep when the jam lifted for a second. Brooke wiped blood from her glove onto the snow. "Where is it?" The corporal held the tablet out with both hands. His eyes avoided hers. On the screen, grainy overhead footage showed the ridgeline. 7 dark shapes lay still against the white. The camera panned slowly. It caught a faint distant silhouette on the southern slope, prone rifle tucked in, shifting with controlled movement. Brooke recognized herself by posture alone. The angle of her shoulder, the steady transitions, the lack of hurry. The corporal swallowed. "That's you," he said quietly. Brooke did not react. "Where's the rest?" she asked. The corporal tapped the screen, bringing up a wider view. Beyond the ridge crest, deeper in the trees, 2 figures moved in retreat, dragging someone between them. A snow camo transport waited farther back, almost invisible, except for the way its shape interrupted the natural line of the landscape. Brooke's breath slowed. She remembered the feeling of crosshairs settling on a man's back, the clean certainty of a shot she could make. She remembered the decision not to. The corporal's voice came softer. "Why didn't you take them?" Brooke looked at him. His face held confusion, the simple moral math of a soldier who believed the safest enemy was a dead one. She kept her answer tight. "Because I wanted them to leave knowing they were watched." The corporal blinked. "That's it." Brooke's eyes stayed on the tablet for a moment longer, making sure the figures continued moving away. "That's enough," she said. The corporal nodded slowly, still trying to understand. Brooke handed the tablet back. "Keep drones up," she said. "Rotate batteries. Watch the ridgelines. Don't assume it's over because it went quiet." "Yes, ma'am," the corporal said, and the way he said it changed. The respect was different now, edged with something else. A little fear, maybe. Not of her intent, of her capability. Brooke turned away before she could see what else was in his eyes. She walked toward the armory container where she had left the rifle earlier. It leaned against the wall, dark and heavy, a tool she had picked up and put down like it was normal. A young sergeant stood near it, hands on hips, staring at the weapon as if it might move on its own. When he saw Brooke approaching, his posture straightened. "Ma'am," he said. "Command wants to know who took the overwatch shots." Brooke stopped a few feet from him. "Tell command the base held," she replied. The sergeant's mouth opened, then closed. "They're going to want your name on paper." Brooke met his gaze. Her expression did not harden. It simply settled into finality. "They can want it," she said. The sergeant licked his lips. "We lost people," he said, not accusing, just raw. "We almost lost everything. If you hadn't." Brooke cut him off softly. "If everyone hadn't moved when they were told, if medics hadn't held pressure, if security hadn't pushed back when the tempo broke, this place would be ash," she said. "Don't build a story where one person saves the rest. That isn't how it works." The sergeant stared at her, caught between gratitude and the need to make sense of what he had seen. Brooke reached for the rifle. She checked the safety, checked the magazine, not because she expected to fire again, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake. A voice behind her said, "Lieutenant." Brooke turned. The base commander stood a few steps away. His uniform was dusted with snow and soot. His face looked carved out of exhaustion. His eyes were fixed on the rifle like it was evidence. He did not approach too close. He did not speak like a man giving a casual order. "Your name," he said, and it was not a demand so much as an attempt to anchor reality. "For the report." Brooke held his gaze evenly. "Lieutenant Brooke Halstead," she said. The commander's eyes narrowed. "Halstead," he repeated, voice quieter. His glance flicked toward the sky where the helicopter had vanished. "Captain Halstead is your husband," Brooke said. The commander's throat bobbed. He took that in, and with it the implication. A nurse here on an anniversary rotation. A husband bleeding. A rifle on a ridge. He looked past her to the ridgeline. "That was you." Brooke did not answer immediately. She did not deny it. She did not claim it. "We held together," she said finally. The commander's jaw tightened. "Command is going to ask questions." Brooke nodded once. "They can ask." The commander studied her face, as if searching for arrogance, for fear, for the kind of expression that explained an impossible day. He found none. "All right," he said at last. "We're doing a preliminary debrief in the ops trailer. Now." Before the story turns into something else, Brooke followed him. Inside the ops trailer, the air was hot and stale, packed with bodies. Screens were backup and limited capacity lines of data crawling slowly as systems rebooted. A map of the perimeter glowed on one monitor. On another, drone footage replayed in a loop. A few soldiers fell silent when Brooke entered. The commander gestured toward a table. "Sit." Brooke stayed standing. "I'm fine." A lieutenant from security started speaking, summarizing positions breaches, estimated enemy count, casualties. The words were clipped professional. They sounded thin compared to what it had felt like outside. When he reached the ridge engagement, he hesitated. "Overwatch fire disrupted their command element," he said carefully. "We regained ground." The commander's eyes remained on Brooke, who... The room held its breath. Brooke could feel the weight of attention. She could feel how quickly stories formed in a place like this, how people needed a single point to blame or praise because a collective truth was harder to hold. She spoke quietly. "I engaged," she said. A murmur rippled. Surprise, disbelief, a hint of relief that the unknown had a name. The security lieutenant blinked. "Ma'am, with respect, you're medical." Brooke's gaze stayed steady. "I'm trained," she said, and kept it at that. The commander's lips pressed together. He looked like he wanted to ask what kind of training, where, when, under whose authority. Instead, he asked a question he could legally ask. How many rounds? Brooke did not look at the drone footage. She did not need it to count. 7 on the ridge, she said. Someone exhaled sharply. The commander's voice stayed controlled. "Any wasted rounds?" "No," Brooke said. The commander nodded slowly as if confirming a fear. "And you chose to let 2 retreat." Brooke's eyes flicked up. "Yes." Why, the security lieutenant asked before he could stop himself. Brooke looked at him. "Because dead men don't report," she said. "I wanted them to leave carrying uncertainty. I wanted whoever sent them to understand this site is not an easy test." The room went quiet. The commander's gaze moved to the drone tablet, then back to her. "You're thinking beyond the fence line," he said, voice low. Brooke did not deny it. She had been thinking beyond survival the moment she saw the breach pattern. A soldier near the back swallowed. "They were probing us," he said, more statement than question. The commander's face tightened. "We don't know that yet." Brooke's voice came calm. "It wasn't random," she said. "They targeted radar relay. They jammed comms. They anchored suppression and used mortars to shape movement. That's not a raider's plan." The commander stared at her, then nodded once, unwillingly accepting the logic. Outside, the sound of another aircraft approached, heavier, lower, different from the medevac bird. The commander turned his head slightly, listening. Brooke listened too. The rhythm of rotors carried through the walls. The commander straightened. "Reinforcement is landing," he said. Brooke didn't move toward the door yet. She felt the eyes on her again. She felt the unspoken question that hung behind every official one. "Who are you really?" Brooke kept her posture composed because she could not afford anything else. She had learned long ago that if you gave people a crack, they would pry it open until your past spilled out in the messiest way possible. The commander looked at her as if making a decision. "You're coming with me to meet them," he said. "You will answer what you need to answer and nothing you don't." Brooke nodded once. They stepped out into the yard as the new helicopters descended through gray sky. Snow whipped up again, flattening against buildings, stinging skin. Men in heavier gear began to move at the edge of the landing zone, shapes resolving through the wash. Brooke stood still, feeling the rifle strap cut across her shoulder, feeling the cold press and feeling the base around her hold its breath in a new way. Not because it was under fire, because someone else had arrived to measure what had happened here. The helicopters settled into the yard with the controlled violence rotors carving the air and flattening the snow into rippling sheets. The landing zone lights blinked through the wash. Men moved in the storm of white like shapes cut from iron, low and fast, rifles up muzzles, tracking corners the way experienced operators tracked breath. Brooke stood near the ops trailer with the base commander and 2 security NCOs. She did not square up like she was on inspection. She stood like she belonged in cold and noise because right now she did. Her cheeks burned from wind. Her gloves were stiff with dried blood. The rifle strap still cut across her shoulder, a weight she felt in every inhale. A ramp dropped. The first team poured out. They were not dressed like the base defenders. Their gear was tighter, darker, layered with intent. No wasted movement, no shouted questions. They fanned outward in an arc, checking lane, sweeping the tree line, confirming the retreat was real. The base commander stepped forward, raising a hand for attention. His mouth moved, but the rotors chewed his words into nothing. A man at the front of the arriving team held up a gloved fist. The operators froze in mid-motion, then shifted into a tight cluster with the precision of a hinge closing. The leader turned toward the commander, helmet tucked under one arm, snow gathering along the seams of his uniform. The rotors spun down gradually, the violent wind easing into something less punishing. When the noise dropped enough for voices, the commander spoke. "Naval Special Warfare," he said, breath fogging. "We had a coordinated assault. Breach on the north fence. Radar relay hit. Comms jammed. Enemy withdrew." The team leader's eyes moved across the yard, reading evidence the way Brooke read vital signs. Burned motor pool. Fresh drag marks. Blood on snow. Men wrapped in blankets. A line of security reinforcing the fence with wire and boards. It was the aftermath of a fight that could have ended differently. He nodded once. How many attackers? Estimated 10 to 12, the commander said. 7 confirmed down on the ridge. 2 retreated. Unknown additional wounded. The leader's gaze lifted toward the ridgeline. He did not look impressed. He looked cautious, as if any number spoken aloud was only half true until he verified it himself. A younger operator beside him raised a compact drone case. Another pulled a tablet from a pouch and flicked it on. Their movements were quiet, practiced, almost calm. The commander shifted. "We need to coordinate intel collection and perimeter sweep." The leader's eyes finally came down from the ridge and landed on Brooke. He did not blink. Not at first. His gaze locked on her face with a stillness that made the air around them feel different, as if the cold had sharpened. Brooke felt it like pressure on the back of her neck. The way you felt a stare before you turned. The way the body recognized a tension that carried history. She turned her head fully. The leader's expression did not change much. A tightening at the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes. But Brooke saw it anyway because she had spent years reading men who lived behind masks. Recognition moved through him like a silent shock. A younger SEAL, maybe late 20s, followed the leader's gaze, then looked at Brooke again with confusion. His eyes dropped to the rifle strap. They flicked back to her rank patch. "No way," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard now that the rotors had eased. The leader did not take his eyes off Brooke. "It is," he said. The base commander glanced between them, thrown. "You know Lieutenant Halstead." The leader's voice stayed even. "I know her." Brooke kept her face neutral. She did not step forward. She did not offer her hand. She had learned long ago that when people recognized you in the wrong place, the safest move was to give them nothing they could hold. The leader took a slow step closer, stopping just outside her personal space. He held his helmet under one arm. Snow clung to his beard, more gray in it than Brooke would have expected. His eyes were sharp, older than his face. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. Brooke met his gaze. "I didn't expect to be here." The younger operator looked from one to the other, trying to reconcile the conversation with what his drone tablet was already pulling up. His mouth opened, as if he wanted to ask a question and could not decide which one. The base commander cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Halstead engaged from the South Ridge," he said, as if he needed to put facts in the air to keep the world from turning into rumor. She disrupted their command element. The younger operator's head snapped toward Brooke. His eyebrows lifted. He looked like a man who had just heard a legend walk out of a snowstorm. The SEAL leader did not react to the commander's explanation. He was still studying Brooke. "You're on rotation," he said, voice low. "Yes," Brooke answered. "Medical," he said. "Yes," she replied again. The leader's jaw tightened as if those words were stones he had to swallow. "And you just happened to be the only one who could break a coordinated assault." Brooke did not flinch. "The base held," she said. "People did their jobs." The leader's eyes flicked toward the ridge. 7 bodies on that ridge say someone did more than their job. Behind them, the younger operator swiped on his tablet. He held it up, angled so the leader could see. The drone feed had locked on the ridgeline, the shapes still visible. The camera zoomed, slightly tracking bullet impact points by pattern analysis. Clean-spaced, no waste. The younger operator swallowed. 7 shots, he said, voice awed despite himself. 7 neutralizations. No flyers. The base commander looked unsettled. He glanced at Brooke like he had not fully understood what he was hearing until now. Brooke kept her posture calm. She felt the urge to pull her gloves tighter to cover her hands as if they were the part of her that gave her away. She resisted. The leader stepped half a pace closer. His voice dropped, meant for her alone. "You weren't supposed to exist anymore." The younger operator heard enough to stiffen. "Sir," he started, then stopped when the leader cut him off with a look that could have sliced through steel. The base commander's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" The leader didn't answer. He turned slightly toward the commander, shifting the conversation back into official shape. "We'll do a perimeter sweep, collect anything we can confirm no remaining elements," he said. "Then I need full debrief from your site." The commander nodded, quickly relieved to return to protocol. "We've got preliminary already. Inside ops." The leader's eyes returned to Brooke. "You're coming." It was not a request. Brooke nodded once. They moved towards the ops trailer. As they walked, the younger operator fell in beside the leader, but kept glancing at Brooke like he couldn't stop himself. Curiosity fought against discipline in his face. Inside the trailer, the air felt hot thick with bodies and electricity. The screens were stabilized in limited capacity. A perimeter map glowed on one monitor. On another, the drone replay looped, showing the ridge bodies like dark punctuation marks against white. The base commander started speaking, summarizing again. Breach point, jam, radar relay, mortar impacts, casualty count. He tried to sound steady. His voice still held the tremor of a man who had watched his command almost disappear. The SEAL leader listened without interrupting, eyes moving between the commander, the map, and the drone footage. When the commander finished, the leader asked questions that came sharp and precise. "First blast time. 1340, the commander said. "Second blast. Within seconds. Radar relay downtime. Within minutes. Comms jam frequency. We couldn't tell," the comms tech said, stepping forward nervously. It was wide, like they flooded the band. The leader nodded once, then turned to Brooke. "Range to ridge?" he asked. Brooke answered without hesitation. 630 yards to the Overwatch gunner position. The comms tech stared at her. The base commander blinked as if realizing she had measured the fight in units most people didn't even think in. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "Wind, 15 miles per hour, gusting during initial engagement," Brooke said. "Dropped slightly during the second element movement." The younger operator exhaled, softly impressed in a way he tried to hide. The leader asked order of engagement. Brooke looked at the map, then spoke like she was reading a chart. Overwatch gunner first, then team lead, then radio handler, then mortar site assembly, then flanker attempting east reposition, then equipment mover toward transport, then a final confirmation target to pin retreat. The base commander's mouth tightened. "You identified a team lead and a radio handler under snow concealment." Brooke met his gaze. "They acted like leaders," she said simply. The leader leaned closer, voice low. "And you let 2 walk." The room went still. The base commander's eyes snapped to Brooke. "You did." Brooke nodded once. Why, the commander demanded, unable to keep the emotion out of it now. Brooke's voice stayed level. "Because survivors report," she said. "Because fear travels faster than bodies. Because I wanted whoever sent them to feel uncertain about using this site as a test." The commander stared, anger and gratitude twisting together. He looked like he wanted to argue and couldn't find a clean argument. He had just watched his base almost become an ash smear. He also knew the difference between killing and choosing. The SEAL leader's gaze held Brooks. "You left a message," he said. Brooke didn't correct him. She didn't soften it, yes. The younger operator could not hold it anymore. "Ma'am," he said, voice careful but charged, with respect. "That shot pattern on the ridge, the way you broke their tempo, that's not just marksmanship, that's doctrine." Brooke turned toward him fully. His shoulders straightened instinctively like he'd stepped into a spotlight and felt it burn. "You were trained by someone who believes in patience over speed," Brooke said calmly. The younger operator blinked. "How do you know that?" Brooke's eyes flicked to his hands. "Your trigger discipline," she said. "Your breathing. You shift your weight before you speak." The SEAL leader's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Almost. She hasn't lost it," he said softly. The younger operator swallowed hard. "Is it true," he asked, voice dropping without meaning to. "Is it true you ran live fire surgeries under cover?" The room froze again, a different kind of silence now heavy with the weight of something that did not belong in an ops trailer in Minnesota. Brooke held the younger man's gaze. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She simply let the question hang unanswered in a way that answered enough. The base commander looked between them, baffled. "What are you talking about?" The SEAL leader cut in, voice firm. "We're not having that conversation here." He turned to the commander. "Your attackers. Any recovered equipment?" A security NCO slid a bag onto the table. Inside were fragments of electronics, a compact jammer component, a small piece of metal marked with serial etching that had been deliberately scratched. It looked like someone had tried to make it untraceable and failed. The SEAL leader studied it, then nodded to his team. "Bag it, photograph, chain of custody." The younger operator typed quickly on his tablet, pulling up satellite overlays. He pointed at a map. "There's activity along multiple northern installations," he said, voice tightening. "Similar signatures. Small teams. Quick hits, probing. They're testing response times and vulnerabilities." The base commander's face went even paler. "You're saying we're not the only one?" "I'm saying you weren't picked at random," the younger operator answered. Brooke watched the map. She felt no surprise. She had known it from the first gunfire rhythm. This was not a desperate raid. It was deliberate measurement. The SEAL leader's gaze returned to Brooke again, quieter now, more personal. "Your husband," he said. Brooke's throat tightened. "He's airborne. He doesn't know," the leader said, and it wasn't a question. Brooke kept her face still. "He knows I'm a nurse." The leader's jaw flexed. "He deserves the truth." Brooke's voice came softer but not weak. "He deserves peace." The leader stared at her for a long beat. Brooke could feel the past sitting between them like frost, a shared history that did not belong in this room. She had walked away from it. He had stayed in it long enough to grow older inside his eyes. Outside, boots crunched. A soldier shouted for a medic. The base kept moving. The leader leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "They're going to dig," he said. "Your shots are already on record, drone footage, witnesses. Your name is in the rotation log. You can't put this back in the box." Brooke met his gaze. "They can dig," she said. "They won't get what they want." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You still think you control it?" Brooke's expression did not change. "I always did." The younger operator looked up from his tablet, catching pieces of the tension and not understanding any of it. He shifted his stance, unsure whether to step away or lean in. The base commander rubbed a hand over his face. "We need a full report for regional command," he said, voice strained. "They're going to want to know who engaged, who authorized it." The SEAL leader answered before Brooke could. "I'll handle the phrasing," he said. "And you'll keep your people focused on recovery and defense, not stories." The commander's eyes flicked to Brooke again. "Lieutenant," he said slowly. "What is your background?" Brooke held his gaze. Her voice remained calm. Army nurse, she said. The commander's mouth tightened. That's not enough. It's what's relevant, Brooke replied. The commander looked like he wanted to push. He looked like he knew it would be pointless. A comms tech interrupted, voice rushed. We're getting partial comms back, short windows. The SEAL leader nodded. Send a sit rep now. Breach contained. Enemy withdrew. Reinforcement on site. Request intel support. The tech nodded and rushed out. Brooke felt the shift in the room. The initial crisis had passed. Now came the second kind of danger. The kind that moved through paperwork and questions and quiet conversations between people with authority. The SEAL leader stepped closer to her again, his voice nearly a whisper. You shouldn't be here, he said. Brooke's eyes held his. Neither should you, she answered. His gaze flicked toward the door, toward the yard, toward the ridge. Then back. You were declared, he started. Brooke cut him off softly. Not here. The leader's jaw tightened. He nodded once, accepting the boundary, though it cost him. Outside, the trailer snow fell in a slow drift again, as if the sky was trying to erase the day. Inside, the drone footage replayed silently, the ridge bodies unmoving, the southern slope silhouette shifting with precise calm. Brooke watched it for a second longer, then turned away. The SEAL leader's voice followed her low and steady. Your shots saved this site, he said. Brooke did not let herself react to the praise. She had learned praise could become a leash. We held, she said again. The leader studied her, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something only he could see. He stepped toward the door. We sweep the perimeter, he said, voice back to official. We collect everything. We confirm no remaining elements. Then we move. Brooke followed him out into the yard, cold air hitting her face like a reset. Soldiers watched as she walked with the SEAL team leader, their eyes tracking her with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The younger operator fell in behind them. He glanced up at the ridge, then at Brooke, then at the rifle on her shoulder. He could not help himself. Ma'am, he said, quietly, careful not to be heard by the base commander. How do you do that? How do you stay that calm? Brooke did not look at him as she answered. You don't stay calm, she said. You stay useful. They moved toward the north side where the fence had been breached. Wire was already going up. Men worked with numb fingers, cursing under their breath, stamping feet to keep circulation. The tree line stood dark and silent, giving nothing away. Brooke's eyes kept scanning the ridges anyway. The SEAL leader walked beside her, his gaze matching hers, both of them listening to the quiet, the way hunters listened to a forest that had gone still for a reason. Behind them, inside the ops trailer, the drone tablet continued recording time, stamping every frame, every choice, every shot, building a record that would not care about Brooke's desire to remain only a nurse. The north fence line looked like a mouth that had been torn open. Chain link sagged in broken arcs. Posts leaned at odd angles. Snow filled the gap as if trying to stitch it shut, but the blackened edges of the blast still showed through a raw seam in the white. SEALs moved along the perimeter with silent efficiency, checking for tripwires and secondary devices. A base security squad followed behind them, faces tense, hands stiff on rifles. Every few yards someone stopped to mark an impact point or pick up a fragment of metal and drop it into an evidence bag. Brooke walked just behind the SEAL team leader, eyes scanning the tree line and ridge line like they might blink and reveal movement. The wind had eased slightly. That made the quiet, sharper, more dangerous. With less wind sound carried, with less snow swirling, sight lines opened. It also meant the forest could hear you breathe. The younger operator carried his tablet in both hands, drone feed split across the screen. He adjusted antenna angle, then frowned. We're getting clean returns now, he said. The base commander, trudging beside them, looked up. Comms are back. Partially, the comms tech called from behind, breath fogging. Still spotty. The SEAL leader nodded without turning. It'll come and go, he said. They don't jam forever unless they're still close. Brooke's gaze flicked toward him. Close, like how close? The leader's eyes stayed on the tree line. Close enough to listen. A soldier near the wire swallowed hard. He tightened his grip on his rifle like it could keep the cold from entering his bones. They reached the point where the breach had torn through the fence line and into the drifted yard. Charred snow formed a gray crater. A few feet away, a chunk of plastic casing lay half-buried, cracked, clean through. Brooke recognized it instantly as the motion sensor housing she had noticed earlier. She crouched and picked it up. The crack she'd seen before had spread into a full break. Inside, the wiring looked deliberate, not just cold, stressed. The casing had been weakened before the blast ever hit. Mason's voice echoed in her head, casual. Plastic gets brittle. Brooke closed her fingers around the fragment and felt anger flicker fast and cold. Not at him. At the way quiet erosion became catastrophe when no one had time to care. The SEAL leader glanced down. That sensor was compromised. Brooke nodded. They had access, or they observed long enough to know where to hit. The younger operator looked up from his tablet. His face tightened. "I've got something," he said. Brooke's head lifted. "Where?" He turned the tablet so the leader could see. The drone feed showed a far ridgeline beyond the original north ridge, a slightly higher contour that ran parallel to the base like a second spine. 3 faint heat signatures blinked on the screen. The younger operator's voice came clipped. Movement along the far ridge. Not retreat. Positioning. The SEAL leader's jaw tightened. They left a rear element. The base commander's face drained. "We just stabilized." Brooke watched the screen. The signatures moved in a pattern that made her stomach tighten. One paused, then shifted. Another stopped and stayed low. The third lingered near an object that looked metallic even through thermal overlay. "Launcher," Brooke said quietly. The younger operator looked at her. "That's what I was thinking." A perimeter guard nearby lowered his rifle a fraction, eyes darting between the tree line and the tablet. His posture had the exhausted looseness of a man who thought the danger had passed a minute ago and now felt foolish for it. Brooke stood. She did not wait for a formal order. She turned toward the southern slope. The SEAL leader moved with her, not asking why this time. He glanced over his shoulder and signaled 2 operators with a hand motion. They fell in behind him, silent shadows. The base commander started to speak. "Lieutenant, we need to coordinate. We need—" Brooke's gaze cut to him, calm and final. "If they set up on that ridge with your perimeter and reset, you'll be triaging in the dark," she said. "Keep people low. Keep them inside hard cover. Do not let anyone cluster." The commander swallowed and nodded, fear making him obedient. Brooke walked, not ran. Running wasted oxygen and made your pulse too loud in your ears. The cold punished frantic movement. She kept her breathing-controlled steps, measured boots biting into crusted snow. The rifle felt heavier now, not from weight, but from consequence. They climbed the southern ridge in a tight file. The SEAL leader moved smoothly, choosing footing without hesitation. The operators behind him kept spacing, watching angles. Brooke recognized the rhythm of their movement, the quiet competence. Halfway up, she dropped to one knee and listened. No gunfire, no engines. Just wind threading through pine and the faint creak of trees shifting under snow. That absence did not comfort her. It sharpened her focus. They reached the rock shelf again. Brooke went prone without needing to be told. The rifle settled into the snow. Her cheek pressed to cold metal. Through the scope, the far ridge came into focus. 3 shapes. One was prone, setting up a position with the calm patience of someone who planned to wait. Another was scanning with binoculars, head moving in slow arcs. The third crouched over something, metallic hands working, quickly, shoulders tense. Brooke adjusted elevation. The valley had warmed slightly from rotor wash, subtle but real. Wind had softened, less drift, clearer sound. The first operator lifted his head a fraction, perhaps sensing the stillness, perhaps reacting to something he could not name. Brooke centered crosshairs on his upper chest. She exhaled slowly until her lungs emptied. She pressed the trigger. The recoil felt smaller this time, almost distant. The shot cracked and vanished. The prone figure dropped without drama, as if the ground had simply pulled him down. The second operator rolled instinctively, trying to find the source. His binoculars flew from his hands and disappeared into snow. He raised his rifle, scanning too wide, too late. Brooke corrected for a slight shift and fired again. He collapsed halfway through lifting his weapon. The third operator froze. A pause where understanding tried to catch up. Then he grabbed the launcher and pivoted downhill, moving with urgency, now aiming toward the cluster of buildings where the aid station sat. Brooke tracked him. Her finger took the slack out of the trigger. For half a heartbeat she hesitated. Not because she could not make the shot. Because a part of her, the part she had tried to keep alive for 8 years of marriage, whispered that 2 was enough. That she had already done too much. That every round carried a cost she would pay later in silence. Then she saw the angle of the launcher, the line it drew toward the wounded men and women below. The medics still wrapping bandages. The soldiers still shaking with adrenaline. She fired once more. The third operator dropped into the snow, the launcher slipping from his hands and turning useless. The valley held its breath. Brooke stayed prone, scanning through the scope for another minute, then another 30 seconds. She searched for a counter-sniper glint, for bait, for movement that did not belong. Nothing. The SEAL leader lay beside her now, binoculars up. He lowered them slowly. "That's it," he said quietly. Brooke did not answer right away. She kept watching until her eyes ached. Then she safed the rifle and pushed herself up. Her knees felt heavy. The adrenaline was thinning, leaving behind the weight of what she had done. They descended in silence. When Brooke stepped back into the yard, the atmosphere had shifted again. People moved with less panic and more awe. Word traveled fast in small places. A second element had been stopped before it could re-engage. The idea spread through the ranks like heat. A soldier she didn't recognize approached slowly, eyes fixed on her face. He looked like he wanted to say thank you and couldn't find words that felt big enough. Brooke nodded at him once, then kept walking. The base commander met her near the ops trailer, face-tight, voice shaking at the edges. "We had you on the drone," he said. "Second ridge, 3 more. Brooke didn't confirm. She didn't deny. "Keep your people alert," she said. "No one goes outside alone. Reset your watch schedule. Rotate guards so fatigue doesn't win." The commander swallowed and nodded rapidly, grateful for anything that sounded like control. The SEAL leader stepped forward. He looked at Brooke like he was studying a problem he could not solve with tactics. "You know they'll hear about this," he said. Brooke met his gaze. "Let them," she replied. He held her eyes for a long moment, then gave a small nod, acceptance mixed with something heavier. He turned and barked orders to his operators preparing for extraction, intel sweep, evidence collection. The younger operator lingered, glancing at Brooke like she had become a living question. Before boarding, the SEAL leader returned to her one last time. His voice dropped low. "They're going to ask for confirmation." Brooke's face remained calm. "Then tell them she stayed dead," she said. The leader's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to argue and knew it would be pointless. He nodded once. The helicopters lifted again, rotors beating the air, then faded into the northern sky. Snow settled back into quiet. Brooke stood in the yard as the sound vanished, the base suddenly feeling too small for everything it had held. Her hands were numb. Her shoulders ached. When she exhaled, it felt like she had been holding her breath all day. A phone call came just before dusk. The regional hospital in Duluth. A voice on the other end that stayed professional, careful. "Captain Halstead is stable," the doctor said. "Surgery is complete." Brooke's grip tightened around the phone. "What did you find?" A pause. Major vascular injury. The limb was not salvageable. Amputation below the knee. Brooke closed her eyes for half a second. Not to hide emotion. To file it where it belonged so she could keep functioning. "Any complications?" she asked. "Risk of infection," the doctor said. "Risk of cold-related tissue damage. We'll monitor closely. He's awake intermittently." Brooke nodded, even though the doctor couldn't see. "I'm coming," she said. She hung up and stood behind the communications trailer for a long moment, snow drifting lightly around her boots. The cold no longer felt sharp. It felt distant, like her body had used up its ability to react to temperature. 8 years of marriage. 10 years of silence. And today, the two halves of her life had collided in a valley of white. 3 days later, Brooke walked into Mason's hospital room. The smell hit first. Clean sheets, antiseptic, plastic tubing, a faint metallic note that always lingered around surgery wards. It was a familiar world, but this time she wasn't the one in scrubs running the floor. She was a wife with a bag of stale vending machine coffee and a heart that felt bruised. Mason lay propped up against crisp white pillows. His face was pale but steady. The blanket over his lower body formed a shape that ended too soon. A clear bag of fluid hung beside him, dripping at a slow measured pace. His eyes lifted when she entered. There was pride there. There was exhaustion. There was a question he hadn't decided how to ask. Brooke crossed the room and set her bag down gently. She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers interlaced to keep from trembling. Mason studied her face. "They told me," he said quietly. Brooke nodded. "About the leg." Mason shook his head once. "About you." The words landed heavier than the surgery report. Brooke held his gaze. She did not look away. Silence stretched between them, not hostile, just dense. The kind of silence that carried years inside it. Mason's voice came low. "Why didn't you tell me?" Brooke swallowed. Her throat felt tight. "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore," she said. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to understand. "That person," he repeated. Brooke looked down at her hands. She could still feel the rifle stock against her cheek, the trigger under her finger, the clean break of each shot. She looked back up. "The one who can do that," she said. Mason exhaled slowly. "You think being able to do it makes you someone else." Brooke's mouth tightened. "It made me someone I didn't recognize for a long time." Mason's gaze stayed on her steady. "I married you," he said. "I didn't marry a job title." Brooke felt something shift in her chest, small but real. Mason continued, voice rough. "You're the nurse. The one who brings coffee to medics at 3 a.m. The one who pretends you don't care when you do. The one who showed up to my base with terrible cake mix like it was treasure." A faint smile tugged at Brooke's mouth despite herself. Mason's eyes softened. "And you're the other part too," he said. "The part that didn't hesitate when we needed it." Brooke leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. "You're not angry." Mason's jaw tightened. "I'm angry at the people who came for us," he said. "I'm angry at the fact that you carried something alone because you thought it would protect me." He paused, swallowing emotion, catching at the edges. "I'm angry I didn't know you were afraid of yourself." Brooke's eyes stung. She blinked slowly, keeping it contained. Mason reached for her hand. His fingers were weaker than usual, but his grip was determined. Brooke let him take it. "The day I got shot," he said, voice low, "I kept asking if we held. I didn't ask if I was going to lose my leg. I didn't ask if I was dying." Brooke nodded, remembering. Mason squeezed her hand. "Because I trusted you to handle the rest," he said. "I still do." Brooke's throat tightened again. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to have peace," she whispered. Mason's eyes held hers. "Peace isn't the same as not knowing," he said. Brooke inhaled slowly. She looked at him. Truly. Looked at him and let herself see the man who had carried duty like a weight and love like a promise. She slid her hand into her pocket and felt the ring there, cool metal against her skin. For a moment, she considered pulling it out, offering it as the anniversary gesture she'd planned. Then she realized it wasn't a gesture anymore. It was an anchor. She drew it out and placed it in his palm. Mason stared at it, then looked up. Confusion crossed his face, then understanding. Brooke's voice came quiet. "I came to give you this," she said. Before everything happened, Mason's fingers closed around the ring carefully. His throat worked as if he was swallowing something too big. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. 8 years, he said. Brooke nodded, 8. Mason's gaze dropped to the blanket again, then lifted back to her. "We're still here," he said. Brooke squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said. And for the first time since the blast, the word felt like it belonged to both of them. Later, when Brooke walked out of the hospital into the cold evening air, she felt different. Not lighter, not forgiven, just clearer. Back at the site, the ridge would be covered by fresh snow soon. The bodies would be recovered. The fence would be rebuilt. Reports would be filed. Questions would travel up the chain with quiet persistence. Brooke could not control that, but she could control one thing. She could stop hiding from what she was, not because she wanted the past back, but because she had finally accepted that the past did not disappear just because you refused to say its name.